I'd like to start off by saying that this took place when I was 17 years old. I am a male, about 6 foot and 180 pounds. I was born and lived for part of my life in Russia, so therefore people say I look very scary and mean. I live in Lower Michigan now and have lived there for the past few years. Keep this in mind, since this information is important for later in the story. I decided to go for a night ride down a main highway to clear my mind from everything that was going on around me. About 15 minutes into the drive, my gas light popped on. There was a gas station 2 miles ahead, but the only problem was that I hated that gas station. It is well known for human trafficking in the state of Michigan. Now, I've never had a problem myself, but I have seen creepy-looking men preying on younger girls before. I just thought about finding a different gas station, but I didn't want to run the risk of running out of gas. I decided to stop at that gas station, since I really didn't want to have to call my mum and dad at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night to pick me up because I ran out of gas. I was glad to see that nobody else was there pumping gas, so I picked up my pump and started to fill up. Just as it was almost full, 2 more cars pulled up at the same time. The first car was a nicer looking Chevy Impala. The second was a van with no tinted windows and nothing seemed off about it. The van parked at the pump right behind the Impala, which kind of gave me a weird feeling. 3 people jumped out of the Impala. 2 of them looked to be ladies in their mid-40s, and they walked into the gas station. As I finally noticed the third person in the car, I was fired up to see what I saw. It was a girl, around 16 or 17. She was absolutely beautiful, with black braided hair, and looked as innocent as could be. It looked like she was looking for something in the trunk. When the trunk opened, it was very clear that they were on a road trip, and had no idea how dodgy this gas station was, or how dangerous it was at night. Although I may look like a mean guy, I have a soft side when it comes to the ladies. My soft side kicked in, as I decided I should walk over to let her know that I was going to stay here until they left to make sure that they would be safe. As I was about to put the nozzle back into the pump, I noticed a man jump out of the van. He had short hair, with a scraggly, greasy beard, and was very large, a lot bigger than me. Red flags started flying everywhere as he started walking over to her. This is when I noticed another man in the driver's seat, as if he was ready to take off whenever it was necessary. I was about to speed out of there when I realized I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I let something bad happen there. So, I began walking towards the girl, making sure to get in between her and the van, so I could block the path to the van if something went wrong. As I was walking over to them, I noticed he was talking to her in a very soft voice. "Hi, miss. I have a problem with my pump. Would you please help me?" Before she could talk, I interrupted her and said, "I'll take a look at that." He looked at me, and his gaze turned to anger and frustration. She noticed me as well, and I could tell she started to get even more worried. I could tell that she was terrified because she probably thought that I was with the guys, and I was going to help him harm her. Like I said earlier, my scary look did not help her feel safe. He then stated, "I asked the girl, not you." I started to get really scared as he turned his focus onto me. In a trembling voice, I managed to stutter, "No, it's okay. I'll look at it." He got even more angry and stepped back. I used that time to step in between the girl and the guy, and I told her to get back in the car and looked back at the guy. He smelled like he hadn't showered in months. The man started walking back to the van, when I noticed the girl was still hiding behind me, and I got frustrated to see her standing outside of the car. I turned to her and stated, "Look, I need you to get into the car and lock the damn doors," in a stern voice. The man started walking over with a big grin on his face and was now holding a very large crowbar. The girl was still standing behind me, since she was far too scared to run into the gas station. This is when I realized she did not speak English. As he got closer and closer, the more scared I became. As if a miracle was supposed to happen that night, another car pulled into the gas station. 4 men around their mid-20s stepped out. They saw what was going on, and it was clear to me that they knew the dangers of this gas station also. And they began walking over to us. And I'm not gonna lie, but these men looked like a bunch of badasses. When he was about 4 feet away, he reached out. Now I do not believe a girl should ever be hit, nor even with a flower, but I had to. I turned around and shoved her into the car and shut the door as quickly as I could. The man was furious. He grabbed me and slammed me to the ground. When I looked up, I braced myself to be hit with the crowbar he was holding. As I tensed up, I could feel him being torn off me. I was so scared I was crying at this point. The group of men wrestled with the guy for a couple of seconds as the van sped away. The man was hitting the guys with the bar and was able to slip away off into the woods. When the man was gone, I let the girl out of the car. She was still crying, and so was I. She jumped out of the car and into my arms, and I managed to choke up the words and asked if she was okay. I swear on my life I'm not making this up, but she spoke to me in a trembling voice that sounded like Russian, and asked if I spoke the language. Of course I did, since I used to live there, and she didn't let go of me for what felt like hours. I didn't care though. It made me feel good that I was able to comfort her, until the people she was with came out the store and the police got there. The police unfortunately said that they couldn't do much, except to keep their eyes out for another occurrence, since their license plate was covered, and the man had gotten away. It turns out she was with her mum and a translator, and were on their way back to their hotel for a meeting with a few people for a music performance for her, or something like that. She told me about how she visited the White House and a couple of other states. She went on to say that they were on their way to see Lake Michigan, since it's been one of her mother's dreams to see it one day. A couple of days later, there was a report of 2 men at the local Target store walking around aimlessly stalking women. It spread like wildfire throughout the town. One of the men's description was the same as the one I gave, and after that incident, nothing else out of the blue happened, since it was a small and quiet town, with not a lot going on. I am 19 now, and she is 18. We both remember every second of the incident. The fact that all of this took place in just under 2 minutes is hard to fathom. She is now back in her hometown and her home country. I still keep in touch with her and her family to this day, and she is doing very well. She's very strong and was able to move on with her life without having 2 bad forms of PTSD from the event. She claims it was a good learning experience, and she is a lot more careful when she is at a place that she's not familiar with. I still wonder to this day if I were put there for a reason that night instead of somebody else. I wonder what would have happened to her if I had left right away like I wanted to. I hate to think about what would have happened to us if other guys didn't stop to see what was going on. About a month after the incident, I fell into a depression and started heading down the wrong road. After help, therapy, and knowing the men were caught, and her strength to move on, I am doing better today. But I know for a fact I'll never be the same. A couple of months after the incident, I was reading an article online when I saw that 34 men were arrested for a prostitution sting. and I kid you not. The man that I saw had his jail mugshot in the article. I was more relieved to see that they were finally facing the consequences. I informed the girl and her family that the men were caught and will be spending a lot of time in prison. So parents or guardians, keep a very close eye on your loved ones, since you never know what could happen. There are some sick people out there, and could be as near as in your hometown. I am from Florida, which is honestly just a crazy state in general, with a lot of weirdos and generally people you would rather not meet. For most towns, the general rule is that you shouldn't go anywhere by yourself at night, because things can take a turn for the worse very quickly. My story happened a couple of months ago. I was at a gas station, getting something to drink, and I was parked pretty close to the front door, because it was pitch black outside and it was about to storm. The part of town that I was in has a reputation for drugs and sometimes gangs, so you always have to be on alert, which is why I carry pepper spray in my car. On my way back to my car, this random 6-foot-tall guy who looked like your stereotypical creeper with only a couple of teeth comes up to me and asks if he could wash my windshield for a few dollars because he has no money and needs gas. Mind you, it's 11 at night, and he claims that his truck is parked by one of the pumps. So I instinctively looked around and didn't see a truck anywhere. He seemed a little bit sketchy and kept inching a little closer to me each time. I was getting rather scared, being a 5'4" 19-year-old girl, and told him that I was okay, and that my boyfriend would clean it for me. As I'm explaining this, he proceeds to grab my arm and wrist and is pulling me away from the store and to the back of another building that is right next to the gas station, but not lit up by any of the lights. That is when I start yelling and calling for help, as I stupidly did not have my phone on me, as it was still in the car. While I'm doing this, he starts freaking out, so I take the opportunity to yank my wrist away from him as he cusses me. I run and get into my car and begin to drive away. When I turn, I see that he runs away, so I call the cops and explain what happened, and I waited for them to just get there, as I just sat there in silence, wondering if any of this really happened to me. I was absolutely stunned. By the time the cops got there, the man was gone. They investigated the scene and called and explained that they found some rope, duct tape, and a small hunting knife in a book bag. Now, as I'm writing this a few months later and looking back at what happened, I should have listened to my ex about going out, because that night the air was abnormally still and just had an overall thickness to it, which makes anyone's hairs stand on end. Now, I'm too scared to be alone at night, and I still have nightmares. You meet such really interesting people at gas stations. I mean, generally you don't, it's a half-truth. There's definitely a higher proportion of weird or scary people than normal retail shift. But after a couple of months on the job, you learn all the archetypes. The dead-tired norms on their way home, the herds of teenagers on a candy binge, the meth heads who waste their entire month of food stamps on junk, the wine mums, the 24-hour gym rats, the alcoholics on bikes because of their DUI who panhandled $2 for malt liquor. It doesn't take long to see it all, and I've been here for years. Long enough to see what I call interesting, even when your threshold for abnormal is off the charts. You still end up with stories of the inexplicable, or unnerving. I'll start off with the latter. One autumn night, a man and a boy of about 9 came in at 3 a.m. I yelled a half-hearted greeting and barely glanced towards them before back to my phone. The boy makes a slow and cautious walk towards the candy aisle, while the dad makes a beeline for the beer coolers. I can tell by his body language he's somewhere on the scale between unfriendly and angry. Shoulders forward, brisk, stompy steps. I sigh, anticipating an argument I've had many times. Last call was at 2. I can't sell you that. He glances back at me and moves wordlessly down the wall, selects a tea, and heads to the counter. The way he walks gives me the impression he's going to punch me. I ready myself to try and disarm him with a monotone, "How are you doing?" He hard stares me for an uncomfortable few seconds and says, "Pack of Marlboro Reds." Relieved he didn't start whining or bargaining about his beer. I turn my back to him and grab the cigarettes and jump with a start at a yell of, "Jack, hurry up!" I turn back and look past him to see his son at the candy aisle. 1,000-yard stare, not really trying to make a selection. The first real look I've had of him tells me the tears he's fighting wouldn't be his first of the day. I ring in the smokes and tea and say nothing, hoping it will resolve itself. Dealing with this stuff I see on a normal night, I've learnt not to meddle. To no avail this time, as he tosses a grimy $10 bill for his incomplete purchase. And not 20 seconds after the first time, he yells again to his son. That's enough to stop my interest in customer service. Graveyard is an interesting dynamic. Obviously, we're supposed to have the smiley, welcoming personality all clerks are expected to. But also, I'm here alone, and also need to give off an air of security. Cross certain lines, and I stop being friendly. I said, "Hey, relax," in a low tone. He turns back to me with the same intensity, which he just yelled, and answered, "What was that?" He can take 2 minutes to pick the candy bar. You're invalidating any points you'd score for buying him one by being a dick. You can shut the hell up. I tell him, we're done here. Grab his purchases out of his reach and push his money back towards him. As I do, I notice the bill has blood on it. Then I notice his knuckles on his right hand are bleeding. Old caked blood still oozing. Now I'm sure this could get physical. I'm a solid 3 inches and probably 40 pounds larger than him, but who knows what crazy he has in his pockets. Our brilliant company policy doesn't allow weapons, but I keep deterrents conveniently placed in reach. I position myself to grab the pry bar and I tell him, "I bet your boy would like to leave now. He can keep the candy." He gives me the same long, unsettling stare and replies, calmly, "I'll be right back." I didn't stick around to see what he had in mind. I ran and locked myself in the back office and dialed 911. I felt a little stupid describing a run-in with a guy who may just be an asshole, but I watched on the cameras as he rummaged in the back seat, as I described to the operator, and she asked, did he have a little boy with him? Before I was even off the call, I began to hear sirens. A lot of them. It took a few days and a few conversations with the police before I had the whole story. The response had been to an Amber Alert. Jack, tragically, had lost visitation rights to see his son at the boy's request. No context with a simple kidnap. His ex-wife was found unrecognizably mutilated with a claw hammer. The wounds on his hands were splinters from her skull, and this happened 6 hours away from my store, and I was the first place they stopped. I try not to dwell on what might have happened. if Jack had picked a chocolate in a timely manner. I was with my dad on our way to New York City, and we stopped at a gas station very early in the morning, at around 8 a.m. I was very young at the time, around 7, and I was sitting in the back seat of the car with my Walkman on and my headphones on, playing Pokemon Red on my Game Boy Color. As I'm sitting there, he goes to pay for the gas and gets a few snacks for the trip. An old, very old man walks over to the car and opens the door and sits in the front seat. I had no idea what to do. Being so young, I simply sat there, and after about 3 minutes of this old man sitting in the front seat, without saying a word, a 40-year-old man runs out of the gas station screaming, "Hank! Wrong car, Hank!" Hank is still sat in the seat, and the man yells, "Come on, Hank, get out!" "Kid, I'm really sorry. This is my father. He's a little confused." And after a few more attempts, Hank finally got up and left. And to this day, I honestly have no idea why I didn't say anything. I was driving home from work really late. It must have been around 3 a.m. and pull up at the gas station to fill up. I take one of the rear pumps, and I'm just minding my own business, when I notice a girl park her car not too far from me, come out and start filling up herself. She isn't dressed appropriately for the weather. It's freezing cold, and she's wearing this blue, shimmering sequin dress. She looks like she's just come out of the clubs and is making her way home. That's when something else catches my eye, or rather my ear. I hear some people approaching, loud and obnoxiously. It's a gang of youths, somewhere between the ages of 16 to 18, all with their hoods up, wearing their pants really low, and generally trying to be as obnoxious and annoying as possible. That's when they start hollering at this girl, and she tries her best to ignore them. Instead of carrying on their merry way, they decide to approach her and harass her. One of the guys from the group then gets really close to her, starts touching her arm, and generally making her uncomfortable, as they all surround her. I'm not a very confrontational kind of guy, and don't really want to get involved in the situation, but it's really getting on my nerves. I'm about to make my way over there to try and reason with them, when this girl, who hasn't said a word, pulls the pump out of her car and starts spraying each of these guys, then yelled in a very authoritative tone to get away or that she would burn them alive, and she pulls out a lighter from her pocket. These guys ran like crazy. I think this chick was either super brave or super crazy. Either way, they fled, and she was gone shortly after paying for her gas. I don't even want to know the kind of questions she got from the attendant, but I don't think the police were called. At least I didn't hear any when I left. I'm glad to see that girl could defend herself. One night in the summer of 2002, my wife and I had just finished dinner, and were watching a Friday night movie together. We lived on the second floor of an apartment complex that had a main floor apartment and a second floor apartment, one on each side of the lot, that was separated by a driveway, with 2 single-car garages on the end closest to the entryways. She got up to take the dishes to the kitchen while I continued watching. But after just moments, she called me over. "Joel, take a look at this." Curious. I looked, and she was at our front door, which she had opened to have a better look outside. I walked over to see what was going on. "Look," she said, pointing towards the driveway. "There's a car parked in front of our garage." Sure enough, there was a small 2-door Honda like she'd said. At first I rolled my eyes, thinking, Well, if I need to get my car out of the garage, the neighbors better tell their guests to get a move on. I shrugged and turned to get back to my movie. But then something caught my eye. There was a driver and passenger in the front seats just sitting there, really still. The car key had obviously been turned to the off position, as there were no lights on it at all. I just watched for a few seconds, thinking to myself that if they had arrived, they would get out of the car at any second. If they were leaving, they'd start it up. But they just sat there, still. Something seemed off. So I decided to wait 10 more seconds. Still no movement from either of them. So I opened the door and stood at the top of the stairs. I couldn't see either one of their faces, so assumed they were unaware of me. "How's it going, guys?" I yelled, but not too loudly. I was trying to sound cordial. The driver leaned over, and once he saw me through his window, he seemed to freak out. The guy next to him waved his arms as if he were saying to get out of there. The driver started the car, put it in reverse, and laid foot on his gas pedal. The Honda went straight back and crashed into an SUV, which was parked not too far behind it. Plastic and glass went everywhere, and my wife screamed. Before I could do everything, they threw it in drive and once again laid into the gas. The Honda must have been supercharged because the tires smoked and screeched as they peeled out of our driveway. But they didn't even stop to see if there was oncoming traffic at the street, which passed right by our apartment. Just as the pedal hit the metal, they shot out of the driveway, crossed the street with a smash, and continued going straight down the street ahead, which led to a cul-de-sac. There was no stopping them. The engine roared as they drove straight ahead, and within seconds crashed into a cinder block half wall that the house at the end of the cul-de-sac had, which thankfully, looking back, had been constructed in their front yard. The car crashed into the wall, and rubble seemed to have exploded everywhere. The Honda came to rest on the middle of the heap and was stuck. Smoke and steam were coming from the hood now, and all of the owners in the cul-de-sac were in their front yards in shock, but no one dared approach the car. My heart was beating so fast, and just when I thought to call the police, one of the neighbors yelled that they had done so. Just then, the car started going forwards and in reverse, back and forth, trying to get free from the rubble they were stuck in. At first it seemed hopeless, but it quickly became obvious that they weren't getting out of the car, and they were determined to get out of the rubble. I could hear them grinding the gears, and the bottom of the car scraping. The tires were beginning to smoke too. My wife and I were standing in the driveway, watching this all happen in complete disbelief. But just when I felt confident they were stuck for good, the Honda finally broke free, and it rolled back into the cul-de-sac but then stalled. I don't know how to explain it, but my instincts kicked in. Something told me to run inside, grab my rifle and magazine, and to chamber around. I was in and out faster than lightning. The adrenaline was kicking in, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard in my chest. My wife had walked to the very edge where our driveway connects to the cross street by now. "I have an assault rifle," I shouted as loudly as I could to all the people of the cul-de-sac, "and I have a round in my chamber. The safety is on." "Put that away," an older gentleman yelled at me. Just then, they got the car started again. It took them several attempts to grind it into first gear, but they finally got it, and they floored it once again. This time they were heading back out the cul-de-sac, and on a path aimed directly at my wife. She turned and ran for it, passing me very quickly. "Get around a corner," I yelled. They saw her make the corner and decided I was next, and were driving straight for me. Although I was scared out of my mind, those guys were actually going to try and run my wife over. I shouldered my rifle and aimed right at their faces and flipped the safety off, letting my finger slide over the trigger. I never thought for a second I would actually be in a situation where I had to take a human life. A million thoughts passed my mind in a flash. I was shaking like a leaf. I don't think I could even breathe, I was so scared. I decided if they got to the cross street of the cul-de-sac and kept on their course, I would have no choice. Please God, don't make me do this. I began to squeeze the trigger. This was it. Just then, the driver saw my barrel pointing between his eyes. His eyes got real big real fast, and at the very last microsecond, he cranked his wheel to the left and they almost spun out of control, but barely made their escape, eastwards down the street. My wife was huddled on the ground with her hands over her mouth, shaking and crying. Thank God she was otherwise okay. We were able to give the police the descriptions and license plates, but I have no idea what became of our dos locos cholos. My friend Tony worked at a gas station. He was doing the night shift, and at about 3 a.m, some crazed tweaker runs in and starts knocking everything on the shelves down. Tony's a bit confused, unsure what to do, and just stares at the guy. He realizes that he could be in danger, and so is about to make an escape into the back room to dial 911, when the guy smashes his head on something that he threw into the air and collapses onto the ground. Tony sees that blood is starting to trickle from his head, and he's unsure whether he should go and check the guy for signs of life, or retreat back into the back room. In the few moments it takes for him to make a decision, the guy gets up again, grabs a candy bar on the ground, and leaves. In shock, it takes him 3 minutes before he dials 911, and they don't catch the guy. Alright, let me try and recall this as best I can. It happened a while back, and I try not to think about it any more than I have to. For starters, I used to work in a gas station, but that's obvious enough. It wasn't a place in the middle of the city, but it wasn't way out in the countryside either. It was one of those awkward in-between areas, where mostly it's just low-end houses, fast food joints and gas stations, like the one that hired me. This station was on a 2-lane road that wasn't far from a major highway, and we got a lot of people stopping in for gas who were on their way to the beach for the weekend, or just passing through on their way to the cities around us. Typical of any gas station like the one I worked at, if I do say so myself. But you see, that was during normal hours. Once the sun went down, oh, that was when the fun really started. That was when all the freaks showed up. Late at night, all the shadier customers would show their repulsive faces. Drunks would stumble through the doors and would keep on going for the back wall, where we kept all the alcohol. Teenagers would slink in, trying to buy cigarettes. I'd ID all of them, and some of the cards they showed me looked fake. Some didn't. To be honest with you, I didn't really care. If they wanted to burn their health away, it was their business. Potheads would wander in too, and load up on chips and ice cream. Oh God, the ones who would buy ice cream were a funny bunch. More often than not, they'd ask for a spoon with their ice cream, and we only had the crappy plastic kind. I had one idiot stand there for 20 minutes, trying to scoop the dessert into his mouth with one of those bendy spoons. One time, a guy shoplifted the store right in front of me around midnight. Then he walked outside, called the cops on himself, and just stood there in the parking area, waiting for them to arrest him. I'd followed him outside and asked him what his deal was. He looked at me and said he just wanted a place to sleep for the night. I hadn't expected that, but told him that if he wanted to sell the story, then he should have kept running. That he did. He walked off the property and down the small road, and I heard sirens not long after that. But I suppose I should tell you about the big one. The guy who made me quit my job. I have a tendency to ramble, and like I said, I try not to think too much about this guy. It was another graveyard shift, another night of my life spent behind a cheap wooden counter. I was pissing my life away, but I was doing it for money, so it's all good. And I was better off than most people who walked through those doors anyway. It was 2:20 a.m. or so. I remember staring at the clock in boredom, watching the 2 dots of the display tick on and off as it counted the seconds. That was when I heard the bell over the door, and I looked up to gauge the person who had just stepped into my little world. He was only a little over 5 feet, and looked like he could be 50 years old easily. His skin was rough and saggy. His arms and legs were dotted all over with tiny white hairs, matched by equally white hairs, which hung down in long reams from his head. It was scraggly and matted together. You know how hair gets if you don't take a shower for 2 days? This guy looked like he'd spent 2 weeks without the good graces of any shampoo. He slowly walked his way over to the counter, mechanically, like each step was a deliberate action. Finally, he makes it over to me, and he thumped his hands onto the counter for support. His hands were crisscrossed with various varicose veins. They looked like cracks in broken glass. Lines of black grit ran underneath the edges of his fingernails, and he finally opened his mouth to speak, and gave me a good view of his slimy yellow teeth. Disgusting. He asked in a croaky voice where our bathroom was, and I just pointed sternly towards the back corner of the room. There was a little hallway which held doors to the storage room, and one small bathroom. He lumbered off in that general direction, and I silently thanked God that the weirdo was out of my face. I heard the doors click shut. Once again I was by myself for the most part. The station was silent for 5 minutes, then 10, 15. It started to get weird. How long was this guy going to take in the bathroom? If this were a normal-looking guy, I wouldn't have questioned it. But the man in there was anything but normal. At the 20-minute mark, I journeyed out from behind my counter and towards the bathroom. I knocked on the doors a couple of times and asked if the guy needed any help. I heard him mumble from the other side that he was fine, but he didn't sound all that fine to me. I wasn't about to argue with him though, so I just walked back over to the counter and sat down in my chair. Another 10 minutes went by, and that guy still hadn't come out of the bathroom. I was getting agitated at that point. Eventually I started hearing a noise. At first, I couldn't really tell what it was, but it didn't take long to figure out. I was hearing moaning. I started walking back towards the bathroom once again. This time, I could tell as I neared the door that something definitely wasn't right. It sounded like the man was in pain, maybe even afraid. Sheepishly, I knocked on the door once more, and for a while he didn't respond. But eventually the man managed to choke out 2 simple words: "Help me." His moaning was getting louder, and turned to yelling. I started hearing banging coming from the inside of the bathroom, and I could even feel it shake the floor just a little. I went for the knob, but of course the man had locked himself into the bathroom, and hadn't gotten around to actually trying to unlock it. I was panicking a little. I didn't know if this was just a bad case of the runs or something like that, or if this was something more serious. I started to think that the latter was true, but there was a rancid stench that was beginning to make its way out of that damn bathroom. It could have just been some horrible diarrhea, I thought, and I shuddered a little bit at that. I shouted at him to open the door. He had to unlock it if he wanted help, of course, but he wasn't listening to me. He'd started babbling some incoherent nonsense about how he had to keep the door locked, because he was only safe in that room. They were coming for him, he said. I kept shouting at him to unlock the door, but he was off on a horrible tangent about how they were coming for him, and how they had finally figured him out. All the while, his slurred speech was punctuated by cries for help. He just kept shouting for help. I kept hearing banging. I was freaked out, and in that moment, I didn't figure I had the time to call the cops or anything like that. The man's speech was trailing off, and it sounded like he was in a very bad way. I'd like to say that I didn't freak out, that I knew what to do and handled the situation in a respectable way, but I did none of that. I spent the next 5 minutes pacing in that little hallway, my hands pressed to my head in desperation, while I tried to think of something, anything to do. The man's yelling and flailing had stopped. I noticed, and I was desperate to do something. Finally, I was struck with inspiration. I went into the storage room next to me, and I grabbed a rolling dolly that we used to sometimes move the heavier crates around. Then I rushed back into the hallway, and with all the force I could muster, which must have been a lot thanks to the adrenaline, I bashed the door wide open. The smell that hit me almost made me want to throw up right there and then. I dropped the rolling dolly and stumbled away from the room gagging. I almost fell over, but I steadied myself on a wine shelf. I had to take a moment to catch myself, and it felt like I was going insane. It really struck me that I needed outside help, so I did what any sensible person would have done. I called the police. I assumed the worst. In that moment I saw the man. It had looked like he was certainly dead. He was sprawled out on the tile floor, half-heartedly resting against the wall. His back was slumped over, curving in the space between the wall and the floor, and his knuckles were very bloody. And pockmarks in the wall, which were also licked with blood, made it fairly obvious he'd been punching around. It was obvious enough where the smell was coming from. That man was sitting in a putrid film of brown liquid. Oh yes, he crapped himself. He wasn't even on the toilet, for Christ's sake. I was still on the line with the police. I did my best to describe the scene to them, as much as I really didn't want to know what had happened to the guy in the bathroom. I figured he could still need help. I announced to the operator that I was going back in, and I held out hopes that he was still alive, but feared otherwise. I guess I really went back into the hallway just out of morbid curiosity more than anything else. I had to pull my shirt up to cover my face with it, to keep the smell from overpowering me, but it didn't do much. The guy had a yellowish powder all around his nose and mouth, as well as a little froth in the corners of his lips. His eyes were bloodshot and glazed over. I said to the operator that it looked like he overdosed on some drug. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go outside for some fresh air. I was groggy, mortified, and depressed. A man had just died next to me. At the most, I was out of there for 5 minutes. I could already hear sirens when I stepped into the cool night breeze. Only 5 minutes. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that messed me up bad. When the police arrived, they asked me to show them where the incident had occurred. An ambulance was there as well, and the paramedics were getting their equipment. I led them all to the back, and it smelled horrible. There were still punch marks in the wall, and there was still some of that drug-powdered dust on the floor. But the man who'd been lying there was gone. He was just gone. like he hadn't even been there. I don't mean he was gone in the sense that he just got up and left. There weren't any boot prints, no streaks of liquid on the floor, no handprints on the wall. There was none of that. It was just like he vanished. I can't explain it. I don't want to know what happened that night. I quit a few days later. I couldn't keep going back there. Not after all that. You know, the thing that the guy kept saying replayed in my head. All the things about how they were coming for him. God help me. When I was younger, I worked as a gas station attendant. I was really hoping to do a good job as to impress my supervisor, but I had a few things go wrong that made him lose total faith in me. One of the scariest moments was when a local man drove by the station, hid out across the road, and started shooting at the pumps. My boss was convinced he was aiming for me, but it seemed like I was an unintended target, and that he was actually shooting at our supplies. Paint cans and oil cans suffered the most damage. Couldn't figure out why he'd hold grudges against inanimate objects, but he was a real nutcase. Luckily we survived, with no injuries. I borrowed my husband's van for a shopping trip. Halfway to the store I noticed the brakes were mushy. I headed to a nearby full-service station to get them checked. Just as I reached the corner, the brakes totally failed. I was pumping the brakes like crazy as I flew through a red light in the middle of rush hour. I killed the engines as I slid up the ramp and into the station. The ramp bled the speed off, and I barely missed the pumps. I saw the attendant reach over and hit the emergency cutoff just as I slid past. The van rolled up and tapped the station wall. I sat there shaking like a leaf, still holding a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. The attendant slowly walked over to the van's driver's side window, calmly wiping his hand on the shop rag, slowly looking up at me and asked, "Brake?"